There are lots of different types of support that we can use throughout our speech. And when it comes right down to it, we want to make sure that we are using multiple of these different types of support to keep our speech interesting for our audience. The first type of support that we can use are facts and statistics. A fact is a truth that's arrived at through the scientific process. So this is the moment in your speech when you say, "Did you know that blah, 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 blah," right? So you're just letting your audience know about something that they didn't know before. A statistic, on the other hand, gathers, analyzes, and makes inferences based on collected data. So we're taking a bunch of information and trying to understand a larger picture based on those numbers. And we like numbers as humans. Numbers help us to understand the world. But in a lot of cases, people don't truly understand statistics. So if you are going to be using a statistic in your speech, make sure that you truly understand what it is that you're talking about so that you don't accidentally mislead your audience. A definition simply makes sure that everyone is on the same page. And it's always important to make sure that you define the key terms of your speech if you think that your audience isn't going to understand right away. This is especially important for jargon, for example. If your audience isn't within the specific field and you are using language that is specific to that field, you want to make sure that you let your audience know what that word means so that they can follow along for the rest of the speech. It just makes sure that your audience doesn't tune you out, because if you're using a lot of language that your audience doesn't understand, they're going to not want to listen to your speech. So it's really important to make sure that everyone is on the same page. Another type of support is an example. And examples are specific situations, problems, or stories that are designed to help illustrate something. And I use examples in class all the time, right? I say, for example, la 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 la, and I give you an example. For example, an example of an example, I guess, is if you were talking about Art Deco architecture, and you said an example of Art Deco architecture is the Empire State Building or the Chrysler Building in New York. Now your audience can picture in their heads what Art Deco looks like, because they've probably seen pictures of the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building. And now they're like, okay, that's what Art Deco is. That's what an example does. It helps our audience to picture what something is or is not so that they can have a better understanding of what it is we're talking about. Another type of support is a narrative. And stories really help the audience to understand what it is that we're talking about. And narratives are super powerful forms of support. This is what I mean when I say that I want you to use, quote, personal examples within the speech. What I mean is that I want you to tell stories. I want you to use narratives and anecdotes and really put a human face onto your speech. For example, I could give a speech and I could start off by saying that diabetic alert dogs are specially trained animals who help people who have type 1 diabetes manage their disease. Or I could tell you a story about Luke and Jedi. And I can tell you how on one night, it was a night like any other, and Luke and his family were sound asleep in their home. And suddenly, the family dog Jedi started going crazy, trying to wake up everybody in the house. Lori, Luke's mother, woke and realized what was happening. She turned towards her sleeping son and pricked his finger, only to find out that his blood sugar was dangerously low. See, Luke had type 1 diabetes, and if Jedi hadn't alerted the family to the fact that Luke's blood sugar was low, he could have gone into a diabetic coma and died. However, when Luke was diagnosed with the disease, they trained the family dog to be able to detect Luke's low blood sugar. Jedi saved Luke's life that night, just like many diabetic alert dogs have done for their humans in the past. Those two opening statements of a speech are very different. One simply tells you what my topic is, the other pulls you into the speech and really gets you invested in the story of Luke and Jedi. And that's a true story, by the way. So stories really help our audience to understand and oftentimes put a human face onto whatever topic it is we're talking about. Testimony is another form of support that we can use, and we can use either expert or eyewitness testimony. If we're using expert testimony, we are using someone else's expertise to give credibility to our own claims. So we're expressing the attitudes or beliefs or behaviors that are recommended by someone who is a known expert in the field. We're letting people know, we're letting our audience know what the quote-unquote experts say. And we are letting them know what has been said in the past by these people who have studied this topic so intensely. On the other hand, eyewitness testimony is simply the testimony of someone who was present at an event. For example, if you were to talk about the Holocaust in your speech and you talked to someone who lived through the Holocaust, that would be an eyewitness testimony. So eyewitness testimony is given by someone who had direct contact with the phenomenon of your speech. And there's a few things to consider when you're using testimony. First, you have to ask how you receive the testimony and whether or not the person has any benefit to giving this testimony, if they have anything to gain. And you have to ask yourself whether the information that was gained from this testimony was gathered a long time ago or whether it was more recent. The final type of support that we can use are analogies. And analogies compare two ideas to show similarity between those two things. So, for example, if I was talking about if I was talking about something that my audience wasn't familiar with, I might compare it with something that my audience is familiar with so that they get an idea of what it is I'm talking about. For example, if I were to give a speech about the recent innovation of the flu patch, I could compare it to a Band-Aid that goes onto your arm and administers the flu vaccine rather than using the traditional needle. Now, you all have an image of maybe a large Band-Aid that goes onto the arm and administers the flu vaccine. And when I said flu patch, you might have not known what to think before, but the analogy to the Band-Aid really helps you to understand what it is that I'm talking about. It shows the similarity between those two things. So as I said earlier, there are lots of different forms of support that we can use, and we want to make sure that we are using a variety of these different forms of support so that we aren't just doing fact, statistic, fact, statistic, because that gets boring for the audience. We want a variety. We want a narrative followed by a statistic, followed by a definition, because that is going to keep your audience really interested in your speech, and it's really going to show that you did your homework on your speech as well.